Before we begin, I have a small favor to ask. Hit the subscribe button and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. And before I go any further, let me ask you a question that will make sense once you hear what I'm about to tell you. Have you ever seen something on a screen that you knew shouldn't be there, but the data insisted it was real? Hold on to that thought because what I'm about to describe happened out in the Nevada desert. The first time I noticed those coordinates flickering on the old CRT monitor in our basement storage room, I assumed it was interference from the new cell tower they'd installed near Tonopah. Sheriff Dorsey CR had mentioned frequency overlap in the morning briefing, so I figured it was just electromagnetic noise bleeding into a system that should have been shut down decades ago. The monitor itself looked like it belonged to another era, a bulky gray box with burn-in scars from displaying the same grid patterns for years. It sat wedged behind filing cabinets packed with incident reports from the 80s and 90s. Almost nobody went down there anymore. Only the occasional lawyer digging for old case files or Harlan Voigt, one of the deputies who preferred to avoid the sheriff when he was sobering up, would use the basement as a place to hide. At the time, I had been working for the Esmeralda County Sheriff's Office for 6 years, long enough to know which parts of the job actually mattered, and which parts were just bureaucratic theater. Policing a region that stretched over 3,500 square miles and barely held 2,000 people meant endless drives through empty desert, breaking up water rights disputes between farmers, rescuing tourists who got lost near abandoned mining towns, and spending long, dull hours fighting sleep because nothing was happening. The former sheriff, Cutler Brennaman, who had held the job for 25 years before retiring, used to say that law enforcement in Esmeralda County was 97% loneliness and 3% pure terror. And you never knew when that 3% was going to arrive. The storage room where I found the monitor sat behind a steel door at the end of a long hallway that smelled of mildew and old paper. The building itself had been constructed in 1967, back when the federal government was pouring money into Nevada's rural infrastructure because of the classified projects being run at the northern test sites. The basement had originally been designed as a Cold War nuclear shelter. Thick concrete walls reinforced to withstand everything short of a direct blast. Ventilation systems meant to filter radiation, enough space to hold the entire town for weeks. But by the time I joined the department, all of that had been forgotten. The ventilation hadn't worked in years. The emergency supplies were long gone. Rooms that had once been built to save lives were now nothing but dust, old files, and equipment nobody wanted to pay to dispose of. The monitor sat on a metal desk that probably would have been considered cutting edge back in 1972. Around it were devices I couldn't even identify, panels covered in meaningless abbreviations. Cables running into wall-mounted junction boxes, and something that looked like an ancient telephone switchboard buried under a thick layer of gray dust from decades of neglect. I'd found it completely by accident on a Tuesday near the end of September while looking for a property dispute file from 1987 that had never been properly resolved. The filing cabinets in the storage room followed a system that must have made sense to someone once, but no longer did. Finding anything meant opening drawers at random and hoping you got lucky. After about 20 minutes of digging through yellowed pages, I realized the monitor was on. Not just on, it was displaying something. On the screen was a black background overlaid with white grid lines. Along the edges were markings that resembled topographic elevation data. At the center of the grid, a small white dot blinked steadily, moving from northwest to southeast at roughly 40 mph. In one corner of the screen, a stream of constantly updating numbers scrolled past. Latitude, longitude, altitude, heading, speed. Everything about it looked precise, technical. It felt less like forgotten county equipment and more like something built for military tracking. I stood there for several minutes watching it, trying to understand what I was seeing. The dot never drifted, never changed speed. There was no label identifying what was being tracked, and no documentation explaining why the system even existed. No one left in the office was old enough to remember why it had been installed. Sheriff Brennaman had retired 2 years before I was hired. Once when I asked Voigt about the equipment in the basement, he just shrugged and said it was probably left over from some old government contracts that predated everyone working there now. I should have left it alone. I should have found my file, gone back upstairs, and completely forgotten about that strange monitor tracking something out in the Nevada desert. But my curiosity got the better of me. The same cursed curiosity that had got me into trouble more times than I could count. I started poking around the equipment on the desk and the shelves, hoping to find something that explained what I was seeing. A manual, a note, anything. The drawers were almost empty. Just a few old coffee cups and paper-wrapped sandwiches from the Reagan era, now so hard they might as well have been bricks. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of electrical schematics that looked like they had been run off an old mimeograph machine, I found a thick binder. On the cover, faded red letters Red Desert Shield Radar Network. Operational protocols, authorized personnel only. The binder was heavy, probably close to 300 pages. It was packed with military jargon, technical specifications, and operating procedures written in that dense language that somehow made everything sound both vitally important and completely incomprehensible at the same time. Still, as I flipped through the pages, some things began to fall into place. The equipment in this room wasn't just some forgotten Cold War relic. It was part of a coordinated surveillance network installed across rural Nevada in the early 1970s, back when everyone believed World War II could break out at any moment. Its purpose was to detect potential Soviet airspace violations. The network consisted of 23 radar stations placed on high points across the region, all feeding their data into central monitoring hubs like the one I was standing in now. What really caught my attention was a section near the back of the binder labeled decommissioning procedures. According to the documents, the entire system was supposed to have been shut down in 1983 after the federal government decided it was no longer necessary and no longer useful for national defense. The protocols laid out step-by-step instructions for powering down the equipment, removing classified components, and either reclaiming or destroying the remaining hardware. There was even a checklist that was supposed to be sent back to a federal office in Washington, probably one that no longer even existed, confirming that each facility had been properly taken offline. But the monitor in front of me was clearly still running. It was still tracking something. Data was still coming in from radar stations that were supposed to have gone silent 40 years ago. I flipped to the back of the binder and found the decommissioning checklist. It was completely blank, never filled out. That meant one of two things. Either the shutdown was never completed or someone had deliberately kept the system running without telling anyone why. I spent the next hour going through the binder more carefully, trying to understand how the network worked and what it was designed to detect. Most of the technical details were over my head: frequencies, wavelengths, something called coherent pulse integration. It might as well have been written in Sanskrit, but the operational guidelines were easier to follow. The system was built to track aircraft, missiles, and any other aerial objects moving through Nevada airspace. Special attention was given to flight paths that could indicate Soviet bombers or reconnaissance flights approaching from the north. Each radar station covered a specific zone, and as an object moved from one zone to the next, tracking responsibility would be handed off between stations, allowing continuous monitoring across hundreds of miles of desert. But the part that truly unsettled me was a section titled Anomalous Contacts. It described how to handle data that didn't fit expected parameters. Objects moving at impossible speeds, flight characteristics that didn't match any known aircraft, targets that appeared and disappeared without any logical explanation. The procedure for these anomalies was clear. Record the data, flag it for higher command, and under no circumstances attempt investigation or interception without direct authorization from Desert Shield Surveillance Command. According to the phone numbers listed in the binder, that command unit was located at Nellis Air Force Base, just outside Las Vegas. I looked back at the monitor where the white dot continued its steady progress across the grid. There was nothing obviously anomalous about it. The speed was slow for an aircraft, but not impossibly so. Helicopters could maintain 40 mph easily, and plenty of small private planes flew even slower. The altitude readout showed it at approximately 300 ft above ground level, which was low but not unusual for an aircraft following terrain in mountainous country. The trajectory was perfectly straight, which seemed a bit odd for a leisurely flight, but wasn't necessarily suspicious. And yet, Something about watching that dot move across the screen made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a way I couldn't explain. I was still standing there trying to decide whether this was worth bothering the sheriff about when the dot stopped moving. Just stopped completely stationary. Coordinates frozen at a location I roughly calculated to be somewhere in the mountains east of Goldfield. The readout continued updating, still 300 FT altitude, still the same bearing, but 0 speed. It sat there motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, and then the dot simply vanished from the screen. Didn't fade out gradually, didn't move off the edge of the grid, just disappeared as if whatever had been there had suddenly ceased to exist. I waited for another 5 minutes to see if it would reappear, but the screen remained empty, except for the grid pattern and the slowly blinking cursor in the corner. Eventually, I closed the binder, put it back in the drawer, and headed upstairs to finish my actual work, telling myself it was probably just some kind of malfunction. Interference creating false contacts that the aging system interpreted as solid objects. But that night, lying in bed in my apartment in Goldfield, a town consisting of maybe 300 people, 2 bars, and enough abandoned buildings to make it feel like a ghost town, even though people still lived there. I kept thinking about that dot moving across the screen with such perfect consistency, and then disappearing so completely. The next day was Thursday, which meant I had the Eastern Patrol route, a circuit that took me out past the old mining towns of Diamond Field and Leda, up through the mountains, where a handful of stubborn ranchers still tried to make a living despite the harsh climate and limited water, and then back down through the network of dirt roads that connected isolated homesteads scattered across the desert. The route typically took about 6 hours if nothing went wrong. Longer if I had to stop to help someone with a mechanical problem, or respond to one of the occasional disputes that erupted between neighbors who lived 20 m apart, but still managed to find things to argue about. I left the office around 8:00 in the morning, driving a Ford Explorer that had seen better days, but was the newest vehicle in our small fleet. The morning was clear and cold. Temperature in the low 40s, the kind of weather that made the desert look beautiful instead of hostile. Sunrise painted the mountains in shades of orange and red, and the air was so clear you could see for 50 m in every direction, all the way to the snow-capped peaks of the White Mountains to the west and the darker, more barren ranges to the east that marked the edge of our patrol area. About 20 m out of Goldfield, I passed the turnoff for one of the old radar installations mentioned in the binder. I'd driven past it hundreds of times over the years without paying much attention. Just another abandoned Cold War relic slowly being reclaimed by the desert. But this time, I decided to take a closer look, turning off the paved highway onto a dirt road that wound up into the foothills for about 3 miles before dead-ending at a chain-link fence topped with rusted barbed wire. A faded sign warned no trespassing, U.S. government property, authorized personnel only. But the lock on the gate had corroded away years ago, and someone had pushed the gate open wide enough that you could drive through without much difficulty. The installation itself consisted of a concrete bunker built into the hillside, a radar tower rising about 60 FT above the bunker topped with what looked like a large dish antenna, and several smaller structures that might have been generator sheds or equipment storage. Everything was weathered and deteriorating, paint peeling away to reveal rust, windows broken or missing entirely, doors hanging at odd angles where hinges had failed. The whole site had the lonely, forgotten quality of infrastructure that had outlived its purpose and been abandoned when maintaining it became more expensive than whatever value it provided. I parked the Explorer near the bunker and got out to look around. The wind up here was constant and cold, whistling through the tower's structural supports and making the whole installation creak and groan like something alive. I walked around the perimeter, not really knowing what I was looking for, just trying to get a sense of the place. Most of the equipment appeared to have been stripped out at some point. The bunker doors were open, and I could see empty equipment racks where electronics had once been mounted, cables cut and dangling uselessly. But the radar tower itself was still intact, the dish antenna still rotating slowly in the wind. And when I got close enough, I could hear a faint electrical hum that suggested power was somehow still flowing to the site. That seemed impossible. The installation was miles from any power lines, and there was no sign of a generator running, but the hum was unmistakable. and when I climbed up onto the concrete pad surrounding the tower base, I could feel a faint vibration through the soles of my boots that indicated machinery operating somewhere below ground. I stood there for several minutes, trying to decide whether to investigate further or just leave and forget about the whole thing. The smart move would have been to leave. I had a route to finish, people who might need assistance, and no good reason to be poking around a decommissioned military installation that probably still fell under federal jurisdiction. But the same curiosity that had kept me in the basement the previous day kept me there on that hilltop, staring at equipment that shouldn't have been operational, but clearly was. I never made it inside the bunker. As I was walking back toward the entrance, trying to find a way past the corroded metal door that had partially collapsed inward, I heard an engine approaching, a vehicle coming up the dirt road, moving fast enough to kick up a plume of dust visible from a distance. I quickly returned to my Explorer and waited, trying to look like I had a legitimate reason for being there, hoping whoever was coming wouldn't ask too many questions about why a county deputy was trespassing on federal property. The vehicle that pulled up was a dark blue Chevrolet Suburban with government plates and no markings. Two men got out, both wearing civilian clothes, jeans, work shirts, sunglasses, but carrying themselves with the kind of rigid posture that screamed military or federal law enforcement. The driver was older, maybe late 50s, with gray hair cut short and a face weathered by too many years in the sun. The passenger was younger, early 30s, built like someone who spent serious time in a gym, and wearing an expression that suggested he wasn't happy to find me there. The older man approached my vehicle, and I rolled down the window, trying to project casual friendliness. "Morning," he said. His voice was neutral, professional, the kind of tone that could go friendly or hostile depending on how the conversation developed. "You're a long way from the main road having some kind of problem." "Just checking the area," I said. "Part of my regular patrol route. Sometimes we get people coming up here looking for salvage or a place to dump trash." He nodded slowly, studying me with eyes that didn't match his casual tone. "This is federal property. Technically speaking, county jurisdiction doesn't extend here." "I'm aware," I said, "but we still get calls about trespassers, and since federal agencies aren't exactly maintaining regular patrols out here, we try to keep an eye on things." The younger man had walked around my vehicle and was now standing behind my Explorer, close enough that I'd have to run him over if I tried to leave in a hurry. His hand rested casually near his belt, where I could see the outline of a concealed weapon under his shirt. Not a threatening posture exactly, but not friendly either. "Appreciate the concern," the older man said, "but we've got this site covered. No need for county involvement." He paused, then added, "What brings you up here specifically?" "You said this is part of your regular route, but I don't see much reason for law enforcement to be checking on an abandoned radar station unless you're looking for something particular." I considered my options. I could lie, make up some story about responding to a trespassing report or following up on vandalism. But something about the way these men were looking at me suggested they'd know I was lying, and getting caught in a lie would make an awkward situation worse. So I went with a version of the truth instead. "Found some old equipment in our office basement," I said. "Monitoring system. Looks like it's connected to sites like this one. Still seems to be operational, which seemed odd given that everything I've read says these installations were shut down decades ago. Figured I'd take a look at one of the sites to see if there was any obvious explanation for why the equipment is still running." The older man's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or concern. I couldn't tell which. He exchanged a glance with his partner, some kind of silent communication, then turned back to me. "The monitoring equipment in your office should have been disconnected years ago," he said. "Whatever you're seeing on those screens is probably just residual activity, electromagnetic interference creating false positives." The actual radar installations have been offline since the mid-'80s. He smiled, but it was a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'd recommend leaving the equipment powered down. Old systems like that can be unpredictable, sometimes generate readings that don't correspond to anything real. No point wasting time investigating phantom contacts." "So the network really is completely decommissioned?" I asked. "Nobody's maintaining these sites or monitoring data." "That's correct," he said. "This installation and the others like it are officially abandoned. We check on them occasionally to make sure they're secure and not posing any environmental hazards, but that's the extent of federal interest. He gestured toward the site. As you can see, everything of value was removed a long time ago. What's left is just concrete and metal slowly being reclaimed by the desert. I nodded, trying to look like I accepted his explanation, but my mind was working through the inconsistencies. If the sites were truly abandoned, why were these men here within an hour of my arrival? How had they even known I was here unless someone was monitoring the installation remotely? And why did he seem so concerned about the equipment in our basement, going out of his way to suggest I power it down? Understood, I said. I'll make sure the old monitoring station gets disconnected. Last thing we need is more obsolete equipment cluttering up our storage rooms. Appreciate it, the older man said. He stepped back from my window. The conversation apparently concluded. Probably best if you continue your patrol elsewhere. Like I said, this is federal property, and we'd prefer to keep county personnel clear of these sites unless there's a specific emergency requiring your assistance. I started the engine and backed away from the bunker, turning the Explorer around carefully on the narrow road while both men watched. As I drove back down toward the highway, I checked my rear view mirror and saw them standing beside their Suburban, watching until I was completely out of sight. They didn't enter the installation or appear to be doing any kind of maintenance or security inspection. They just stood there making sure I left. The rest of my patrol passed without incident. I stopped at a ranch to check on a dispute about cattle wandering onto a neighbor's property. Spent an hour talking to an elderly couple who lived 30 mi from the nearest town and mostly just wanted human contact, and helped a tourist from California whose rental car had gotten stuck in soft sand after he decided to take an unmarked road to see if it led anywhere interesting. By the time I returned to the office late that afternoon, the encounter at the radar installation had started to feel less significant. Just another minor interaction with federal personnel protecting property they were responsible for. But when I went down to the storage room to retrieve a file before heading home, I found that someone had been there in my absence. The monitoring station was still there, equipment still connected and apparently functional, but the binder with the operational protocols was gone, removed from the drawer where I'd left it. The desk had been cleaned. All the old coffee cups and trash cleared away, and someone had even wiped down the dust on the equipment panels. It looked less like a forgotten storage room and more like a workspace that was actively being maintained by someone who didn't want anyone else to know it existed. I sat down at the desk and looked at the monitor, which showed the same grid pattern as before, currently empty of any contacts. I thought about the two men who'd arrived so quickly after I'd visited the installation, about their insistence that the network was decommissioned and the monitoring equipment in our office should be shut down, about how thoroughly they'd cleaned this room in the few hours since our encounter. None of it made sense if the system was truly abandoned, and the contacts I'd seen were just electromagnetic interference. I was still sitting there trying to decide what any of this meant when the monitor flickered, and a new contact appeared on the screen. A white dot in the northern section of the grid moving south-southeast at approximately 35 mph. Altitude 250 ft. I watched it for several minutes, tracking its steady progress across terrain I knew was mostly empty desert punctuated by isolated mountain ranges. There was no identifying information, no transponder code, nothing that would indicate whether this was a registered aircraft or something else entirely. And then, just like the day before, the dot stopped moving, held stationary for maybe 20 seconds, and disappeared from the screen as if it had never existed. I waited for it to reappear, but the grid remained empty, showing nothing but the slow pulse of the cursor in the corner and the wind noise pattern that might have been real atmospheric data, or might have been nothing but electronic ghosts in a system that should have been silent decades ago. I powered down the monitor, turned off the lights, and left the storage room, locking the door behind me, even though I'd never bothered to lock it before. As I drove home through the darkening desert, watching the last light fade from the sky, and the stars begin to emerge with the kind of brilliance you only get in places this far from cities, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled across something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Something that was still happening in the empty spaces between the towns and the highways, tracked by equipment that officially didn't exist, monitored by personnel who appeared out of nowhere when someone started asking questions. The smart thing would be to follow the older man's advice, disconnect the monitoring station, and forget about the mysterious contacts moving across the Nevada desert. But 6 years of law enforcement work had taught me that when someone tells you not to look at something, that's usually exactly what you should be investigating. And whatever was showing up on that monitor, whatever was being tracked by a radar network that shouldn't exist anymore, it was happening in territory I was sworn to protect and serve, which meant I wasn't going to leave it alone. Regardless of how much federal personnel wanted me to mind my own business, I was going to figure out what those contacts were, where they were coming from, and why someone with enough resources to monitor remote radar installations in real time was so concerned about a county deputy accidentally discovering equipment that should have been forgotten 40 years ago. That decision made on a Thursday evening while driving home through the high desert darkness was probably the most important choice I'd made in years, because what I was about to discover wasn't just strange or unusual or unexplained. It was something that would make me question everything I thought I understood about the place I lived, the government I worked for, and what kinds of things move through the empty spaces when nobody's supposed to be watching. But that night, I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew something was wrong, and I wasn't going to ignore it, no matter how much easier that would be. The first missing person report came in on Saturday morning, 3 days after my encounter with the federal agents at the radar installation. I was working the weekend shift, which in Esmeralda County meant sitting in the office catching up on paperwork while monitoring the radio for calls that rarely came. Sheriff CR had taken his wife to Reno for the weekend, leaving me and Deputy Voigt to handle whatever emergencies might arise, though emergencies in a county this sparsely populated were more likely to involve livestock than actual people. The woman who came into the office was named Irene Dufresne, a rail-thin 50-something who lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of Goldfield with her husband and teenage son. I'd dealt with the family before. Minor disputes with neighbors, a domestic disturbance call that turned out to be nothing serious, the usual small-town drama that made up most of our actual work. But the look on her face when she came through the door told me this wasn't about trash disposal or noise complaints. This was genuine fear, the kind that makes people's eyes too wide and their voices too tight. "It's my husband," she said before I'd even had a chance to ask what she needed. "Warren, he went out Thursday night to check on something, and he never came back." I pulled out an incident report form and started taking down the basic information. Warren Dufresne, age 52, approximately 510, around 170 lb, last seen leaving their trailer around 10:00 Thursday evening. He'd told his wife he was going to drive out toward the old mining district because he'd seen lights moving in the hills and wanted to investigate. He'd taken his truck, a '98 Dodge Dakota, dark green Nevada plates, and said he'd be back in an hour or two at most. When he hadn't returned by morning, Irene had driven the route she thought he'd taken, but found no sign of him or his vehicle. "The lights he saw," I asked, "did he describe them, what they looked like, how they were moving?" Irene nodded, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the office. He said they were low to the ground, moving slow but steady, like someone driving across the desert with their headlights on, except they were in places no vehicle could go. He thought maybe it was kids joy-riding in an ATV or people looking to strip metal from the old mines. Said he was going to check it out, make sure nobody was doing anything dangerous or illegal. I wrote down the description, trying to keep my expression neutral, but my mind was already making connections I didn't want to make. Thursday night, the same evening, I'd been sitting in the storage room watching a radar contact move across the grid, then disappear. The same general area Irene was describing as where Warren had gone to investigate lights. It could have been coincidence. The desert was full of old mining sites, and people did occasionally venture into them for various reasons, none of them particularly smart, but the timing bothered me. "Did Warren have his cell phone with him?" I asked. "Yes, but it goes straight to voicemail. Either the battery's dead or he's somewhere with no signal, which is most of the county." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something between a whisper and a plea. "I know Warren can be impulsive sometimes, and I know he's not always the most careful person, but he wouldn't just disappear for 3 days without calling. Something's wrong. I can feel it." I assured her we'd start looking immediately, filed the report, and spent the rest of the morning trying to organize a search. In a county this size with such limited resources, search and rescue operations were challenging under the best circumstances. We didn't have helicopters or thermal imaging equipment or teams of volunteers who could be mobilized quickly. What we had was a few deputies, some local volunteers who knew the terrain, and the hope that missing people had simply gotten themselves stuck or lost somewhere accessible rather than injured in one of the thousands of places where you could die of exposure before anyone found you. By early afternoon, I'd managed to put together a small search party. Myself, Voight, and 3 locals who knew the mining district well enough to serve as guides. We drove out in 2 vehicles, following the route Irene thought Warren had taken, scanning the desert on both sides for any sign of his truck or tracks that might indicate where he'd gone off the main road. The mining district was a sprawling area of abandoned claims and derelict structures spread across maybe 30 square miles of rough terrain, riddled with unmarked shafts and unstable tunnels that made searching on foot genuinely dangerous. We spent 6 hours out there driving every accessible road and hiking into areas where vehicles couldn't go, calling Warren's name into the empty air and waiting for responses that never came. We found plenty of evidence that people had been in the area recently. Tire tracks, beer cans, the usual detritus of teenagers or treasure hunters looking for excitement or salvage. But we found no sign of Warren Dufresne or his dark green Dodge Dakota. No skid marks suggesting he'd lost control. No fresh disturbances indicating he'd driven off into rough terrain. Nothing to explain where he'd gone or what had happened to him. As the sun started setting and shadows grew long across the desert floor, we called off the search for the day with plans to resume the next morning. I dropped Voight back at the office, and then instead of going home, I drove to the storage room and powered up the monitoring station. I'd been thinking about it all day while we searched, wondering if there was any connection between Warren's disappearance and the radar contacts I'd been seeing, knowing it was probably paranoid nonsense, but unable to shake the feeling that the timing was too precise to be random. The monitor came alive with its familiar green glow, displaying the grid pattern with its topographical markers and coordinate readouts. I pulled the binder. No, wait. The binder was gone, taken by whoever had cleaned the room. I'd forgotten about that. Without the operational protocols, I had to work from memory and guesswork, trying to understand what the various displays meant, and whether there was any way to access historical data that might show where contacts had been on Thursday night when Warren disappeared. I spent an hour cycling through different display modes, pushing buttons, and adjusting settings based on labels that were faded and abbreviations I didn't fully understand. Most of my attempts produced nothing useful. Error messages, blank screens, or displays that flickered and went dark, as if the system was objecting to being operated by someone without proper training. But eventually, I stumbled across something that looked like a data log. A scrolling list of timestamps and coordinates representing every contact the system had tracked over recent days. The list was extensive, hundreds of entries, most of them probably false positives or atmospheric phenomena that the aging system was misinterpreting as solid objects. But as I scrolled through the data looking for Thursday night, I found several entries that stood out. Between 10:17 p.m. and 11:43 p.m. on Thursday, the system had tracked 3 separate contacts, all in the general area of the mining district where Warren had gone to investigate lights. The contacts had moved slowly, erratically, appearing and disappearing multiple times as if whatever was creating them was moving in and out of the radar coverage zone. And then at 11:43 p.m., all 3 contacts had vanished simultaneously, dropped off the tracking grid at exactly the same moment. I copied down the coordinates, trying to match them to physical locations I could identify on a map. The area was one I knew reasonably well. A section of the mining district characterized by steep terrain and numerous abandoned claims, accessible by a network of dirt roads that connected to the main highway about 15 mi south of Goldfield. It was within a few miles of where we'd been searching that afternoon, but we hadn't ventured into that specific area because the roads were particularly rough, and Voight had suggested we focus on more accessible locations first. I was still staring at the monitor, trying to decide whether this information was meaningful or just confirmation bias making me see patterns that didn't exist when the equipment began to malfunction. The display started flickering, images distorting and fragmenting, and then the entire system powered down with a sound like a transformer blowing somewhere deep in the basement's electrical system. I tried to restart it, but nothing happened. No response to any buttons, no lights, no familiar hum of electricity flowing through ancient circuits. The monitoring station was dead, as completely and thoroughly as if someone had reached in and disconnected its power source. I checked the breaker box in the hallway, but everything looked normal. No tripped circuits or obvious problems. The rest of the building still had power, lights, and computers functioning normally throughout. It was only the monitoring equipment that had failed, and the timing felt less like random mechanical failure and more like deliberate intervention. Someone or something remotely disabling the system the moment I'd accessed data they didn't want me to see. I locked the storage room and went home, carrying a printout of the coordinates I'd copied down and a growing certainty that Warren Dufresne's disappearance was connected to whatever those radar contacts represented. I didn't know what the connection was, couldn't prove anything beyond strange coincidences and suspicious timing. But law enforcement instinct developed over years of investigation was screaming that something wrong was happening, and I was only seeing the edges of it. Sunday morning brought another missing person report. This time it was a man named Gilbert Armster, a 68-year-old retiree who lived alone in a small house near the intersection where Highway 95 met a dirt road leading toward the mountains. His daughter, who lived in Las Vegas and called him every Sunday morning, had been unable to reach him and had driven up to check on him personally. She'd found his house empty, his truck missing, and no note or explanation for where he'd gone. Neighbors reported seeing him Friday evening, loading camping gear into his vehicle and mentioning something about wanting to do some stargazing in a remote area where light pollution wouldn't interfere. The daughter's description of her father's typical stargazing locations matched several areas in the foothills east of Goldfield, including the section where I'd found those radar coordinates from Thursday night. I took the report, promised we'd begin searching immediately, and tried to maintain professional calm while internally calculating the probability that 2 separate disappearances in 3 days, both involving people heading into remote desert areas, both in roughly the same region, were entirely unconnected. Sheriff CR returned from Reno that afternoon, and I briefed him on both cases. He listened with the kind of patient attention he brought to most things, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you think these are related?" "I think the timing and locations are concerning," I said carefully. "Both disappeared within 36 hours of each other. Both were heading into similar areas. Both were investigating or observing something in the desert at night, but no evidence they knew each other. No obvious connection beyond geography and bad timing. Not that I found yet, I admitted. Warren Drain was a mechanic, lived in town most of his life, kept to himself mostly. Gilbert Armster was a retiree, just moved here 2 years ago. Completely different social circle. If they'd ever met, nobody I've talked to knows about it." CR nodded slowly, thinking it through with the methodical approach that had made him a good sheriff, despite the limited resources he had to work with. "All right, we treat them as separate cases for now, but keep looking for connections. Expand the search area, coordinate with neighboring counties in case either of them wandered farther than we're thinking, and put together a statement for the media, local paper, radio station, asking anyone with information to come forward." Sometimes people see things and don't realize they're relevant until someone explicitly asks. The media statement went out that evening. A brief notice in the Goldfield News and on the 2 radio stations that served the region, describing both missing men and requesting that anyone with information contact the sheriff's office. I didn't expect much response. Most people in rural Nevada minded their own business and assumed others did the same. But by Monday morning, my phone was ringing with calls from residents who'd seen things they thought might be relevant. Most of the calls were useless, well-meaning people reporting sightings that were either misidentifications or from wrong time periods, but 3 calls stood out. The first was from a woman named Constance Gilchrist, who lived on a ranch about 12 mi east of the mining district. She reported seeing unusual lights in the sky late Thursday night, described them as moving in patterns that didn't match aircraft or satellites, and said they'd been bright enough that her dogs had gotten agitated and barked continuously for almost an hour. When I asked for more specific details, she hesitated, then said, "Look, I know how this sounds, but they weren't normal. They moved in ways that nothing I've ever seen moves. Sharp turns at high speed, vertical climbs from low altitude, completely silent even though they were close enough I should have heard engines. The second call came from a man named Horace Traz, a prospector who still worked a small gold claim in the mountains and spent most of his time alone in terrain rough enough that most people avoided it. He reported finding strange marks on the ground Friday morning while hiking near one of his dig sites. Depressions in the sand and gravel that were too regular to be natural, arranged in patterns he couldn't explain. He'd taken photographs, he said, and would be willing to show me the location if I wanted to see for myself. The third call was from someone who didn't leave a name, just a brief message recorded on the office voicemail. Stop looking into the disappearances. Stop accessing equipment you don't understand. This is your only warning. The voice was electronically distorted, impossible to identify, but the message was clear enough. Someone was watching what I was doing and wanted me to stop. I saved the recording and played it for Sheriff CR, who listened with an expression that transitioned from skepticism to concern. That's a credible threat, he said finally, which means you've stumbled into something that someone with resources wants to keep hidden. The question is whether we proceed anyway or back off and let federal authorities handle whatever this is. Do we have any confirmation that federal authorities are actually investigating? I asked. Or are they the ones who want us to back off? CR didn't have an answer for that. We sat in his office for several minutes, both of us trying to think through implications and options. Finally, he said, "Follow up on the calls you got. Talk to the woman about the lights. Go see what marks this prospector found. But be careful. If someone's threatening you over missing person investigations, that suggests the disappearances aren't random accidents. And if they're not accidents, then whoever's responsible is already willing to commit serious crimes to maintain whatever operation they're running." I spent Monday afternoon driving out to Constance Gilchrist's ranch, a windswept property with more dust than grass and livestock that looked like they were surviving through sheer stubbornness. Constance was a weathered woman in her 60s who'd lived in Nevada her entire life and had the kind of practical skepticism that came from decades of dealing with harsh environment and occasional nonsense. She walked me through what she'd seen Thursday night, pointing toward the mountains as she described the light's movements and behavior. "I've seen military aircraft from Nellie's," she said. "I've seen drones and satellites and helicopters and all manner of things people fly around out here. These weren't any of those. They moved like they were under intelligent control. But the maneuvers they pulled would have killed any pilot if there was one aboard. And the silence was wrong. Even drones make noise when they're that close." "Did you report it to anyone?" I asked. "Air Force, FAA, anyone who tracks unusual aircraft." She shook her head. "Who'd I report it to? The same people who'd tell me I saw swamp gas or Venus or some classified aircraft I'm not supposed to know about. I've lived here long enough to know that sometimes you see things and the smart move is to keep it to yourself unless someone specifically asks." I thanked her for the information and drove toward Horace Traz's claim. Following increasingly rough roads into terrain that made me grateful for the Explorer's four-wheel drive, Traz met me at a turnout where vehicle access ended. A grizzled man in his 70s who looked like he'd been prospecting since the original gold rush. We hiked another mile into rocky hillsides before he showed me what he'd found. The marks were exactly as he described. Depressions and relatively level ground, each about 3 ft in diameter and maybe 6 in deep, arranged in a triangular pattern with roughly 40 ft between points. The depressions were too regular to be natural erosion, too precisely positioned to be random. And when I examined them more closely, I noticed the ground inside each depression had a fused, almost glassy quality, as if it had been subjected to intense heat that melted sand and rock into a different texture. "Ever seen anything like this before?" Trask asked. "Because I've been working these mountains for 40 years and I've never come across marks like these. They weren't here Wednesday when I last worked this area, appeared sometime between then and Friday morning. I took photographs from multiple angles, measured the distances between depressions, and collected a sample of the fused material for potential analysis. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the radar contacts from Thursday night, trying to imagine what could create marks like these, while simultaneously generating returns on a Cold War-era tracking system and making lights bright enough to agitate dogs from miles away. Tuesday morning brought the news I'd been dreading. A hiker found Warren Dufresne's truck abandoned in a ravine about 20 m from where he'd supposedly gone to investigate lights. The vehicle was locked, keys missing, no sign of Warren himself. The interior was normal. No evidence of struggle, no blood, no indication that anything violent had occurred. It was as if Warren had parked his truck, locked it, and walked away into the desert for reasons nobody could determine. The area where we found the truck was within 3 mi of the coordinates I'd recorded from the radar system before it failed. Close enough that Warren could have driven there after seeing the lights. Far enough that he would have been isolated and vulnerable if something had happened. We organized a large-scale search of the surrounding area, bringing in volunteers from neighboring towns, and using every available resource to cover terrain that was simultaneously vast and treacherous. We found nothing. No tracks, no personal belongings, no indication Warren had been there at all beyond his abandoned vehicle sitting, locked and undamaged in a ravine. Gilbert Armbruster's daughter hired a private search and rescue company out of Las Vegas. Professionals with dogs and drones and thermal imaging equipment we couldn't afford. They spent 3 days searching the areas where Gilbert had planned to do his stargazing, covering miles of desert and mountains with thoroughness that made our efforts look amateurish by comparison. They found nothing either. No campsite, no vehicle, no trace of a 68-year-old man who'd loaded camping gear and driven into the desert to look at stars. By Wednesday evening, both investigations had stalled completely. We had 2 missing men, 1 abandoned vehicle, reports of unusual lights, mysterious ground marks, and no leads that pointed toward anything concrete. Sheriff CR held a press conference asking for additional information. And I fielded dozens of calls from concerned residents and media outlets wanting to know if there was a serial killer operating in Esmeralda County or some environmental hazard making people sick. I had no answers to give them that wouldn't sound insane or get me dismissed as someone who'd spent too much time in the desert sun. That night, I returned to the storage room and tried to restart the monitoring equipment. It remained dead, completely unresponsive, as if power had been permanently cut to the entire system. But when I examined the equipment more carefully, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small network cable running from the main console to a junction box mounted on the wall, and from there into conduit that presumably connected to other systems throughout the building. The monitoring station wasn't isolated. It was-worked, connected to something else, probably transmitting data to locations beyond our office. I followed the cable as far as I could, tracing it through the basement's maze of corridors and utility spaces, until it disappeared into a locked electrical room I didn't have keys to access. The lock was modern, recently installed, completely different from the old hardware on most basement doors. Someone had upgraded security on that particular room within the last few years, making sure it was protected in ways the rest of the basement wasn't. When I returned to the main office and looked through our maintenance records, I found documentation of electrical upgrades performed 18 months ago by a contractor from Las Vegas. The work had been billed as routine modernization of aging systems, paid for by a federal grant program designed to help rural counties upgrade infrastructure. The contractor's name was one I didn't recognize, and when I tried to look them up later that evening, I found their business registration had been terminated and their website taken offline. The address listed for their headquarters was an empty lot in an industrial area north of Las Vegas. No building, no sign anyone had ever operated from that location. The federal grant program that had paid for the work was real enough, but the specific grant supposedly allocated to Esmeralda County wasn't listed in any public database I could access. It was as if someone had created a paper trail that would satisfy cursory inspection, but fell apart under any serious investigation. A bureaucratic smoke screen hiding the fact that outside parties had accessed our building and modified systems without leaving any record of what they'd actually done. Thursday afternoon, I received another anonymous call. Same electronically distorted voice, same basic message. The monitoring equipment is being removed. Do not interfere. Do not discuss what you've seen. This is your final warning. I immediately went to the storage room and found exactly what the caller had described. 2 men in unmarked coveralls were disconnecting the monitoring station, carefully removing components and packing them into shock-resistant cases. They looked up when I entered but didn't stop working. Didn't acknowledge my presence beyond brief eye contact that suggested they expected me and weren't concerned about being interrupted. Who authorized this? I demanded. That equipment belongs to the county. The older of the two men, someone I recognized as the same federal agent I'd encountered at the radar installation, pulled out an official-looking document and handed it to me. It was a federal reclamation order signed by someone with a title I didn't recognize from an agency whose acronym meant nothing to me, authorizing the removal of all Desert Shield monitoring equipment from Esmeralda County facilities. The order cited national security concerns and obsolete equipment requiring proper disposal, and it included language stating that local authorities were required to cooperate fully and maintain absolute confidentiality about all aspects of the system and its operations. This is 2 missing people, I said. 2 investigations that might be connected to whatever this equipment was tracking. We're aware of the disappearances, the man said calmly, continuing to disconnect cables. They're being investigated by appropriate authorities. Your role in those investigations is concluded. Continue with your normal duties. The missing person cases will be resolved through channels you're not authorized to access. And if I don't accept that, if I keep investigating, he looked at me with an expression that was neither hostile nor friendly, just professionally neutral. Then you'll discover that federal jurisdiction supersedes county authority in matters of national security. Your cooperation is appreciated, but not required. The equipment is being removed regardless of your preferences. They finished their work within an hour, leaving the storage room stripped of everything related to the monitoring system. Only the desk and filing cabinets remained, all traces of the radar network erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Before they left, the older man handed me a business card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. If you remember anything else about the system or the data you accessed, he said, call that number. Don't discuss it with anyone else. Don't file reports. Don't try to continue investigating on your own. This is above your clearance level, and pursuing it further will only create problems for you and your department. After they left, I sat in the empty storage room for a long time trying to process what had just happened. 2 people were missing, possibly dead, and federal authorities were shutting down the only lead I had by removing equipment and threatening consequences if I continued investigating. Everything about the situation screamed cover-up, suggested that whatever was happening in the Nevada desert was considered important enough that disappearing civilians was an acceptable cost of keeping it secret. The smart move would be to back off, to follow instructions, and hope that whatever investigation was happening through official channels would actually bring answers. But I'd become a law enforcement officer because I believed people deserved protection and truth. And abandoning that principle now would mean accepting that some people's lives mattered less than bureaucratic secrecy, which meant I wasn't going to stop investigating regardless of warnings or threats or federal jurisdiction. I was going to find out what happened to Warren Dufresne and Gilbert Armster. I was going to discover what the radar network had been tracking and why powerful people wanted that information hidden. And I was going to do it carefully enough that the people trying to shut me down wouldn't realize I hadn't stopped until it was too late to prevent me from uncovering the truth. That decision made in an empty storage room, stripped of all evidence that anything unusual had ever existed there, would lead me deeper into something that made federal cover-up seem trivial by comparison. But on that Thursday afternoon, I just knew I wasn't going to abandon 2 missing people because someone with authority told me to mind my own business. The surveillance footage arrived at my apartment on Friday morning, delivered in an unmarked manila envelope with no return address. Someone had hand-delivered it during the night, slipping it under my door while I slept. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. You want to know what happened to them? Watch this. Then decide if you really want to keep digging. I plugged the drive into my laptop. It contained 4 video files, each labeled with dates ranging from 3 weeks ago to 2 days prior. All timestamps were between 11 p.m. and 300 a.m. The first video showed footage from what appeared to be a trail camera pointed toward a dirt road. The timestamp read October 8th, 11:47 p.m. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then movement at the edge of the frame. Something was approaching along the road, but there was no vehicle. The light was moving by itself, hovering maybe 6 ft off the ground, pulsing with a soft white glow. As it passed the camera, the video distorted, pixels fragmenting. The audio suddenly filled with mechanical humming overlaid with something that sounded almost like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The light stopped at a bend, then divided into three separate lights that arranged themselves in a triangular pattern, the same configuration I'd seen in the ground marks. The three lights descended slowly toward the ground. The moment they made contact, the camera's video feed went completely white. When the image returned 5 seconds later, the lights were gone. The second video was dated October 15th. A single light moving across open desert in a search pattern. Then a pickup truck appeared in the frame. The light immediately moved toward it with incredible speed and positioned itself directly above the truck. The driver got out, looked up at the light, and waved their arms, clearly agitated. The light pulsed brighter, and suddenly the person collapsed. The light descended further, hovering maybe 5 ft above the collapsed figure. The camera distorted again, and when it cleared, both the person and the light were gone. Just the empty truck sitting on the road, door still open. I recognized that truck, dark green Dodge Dakota. Warren Duke Rain's vehicle, and I just watched footage of what had happened to him. The third video was dated October 19th. An RV parked in the foothills. Gilbert Armbruster's favorite stargazing spot. 3 lights appeared in formation, descending toward the RV. Gilbert stood up from his telescope, stepping backward. The lights pulsed brighter. Gilbert's body went rigid and he took 3 mechanical steps forward, movements wrong and puppet-like. He walked directly beneath the lights and stopped. The video distorted, and when it cleared, Gilbert was gone. The RV remained, telescope still pointing at the sky, but no human figure anywhere. The fourth video was dated October 27th, just 2 days ago. It showed the dirt road where Warren's truck had been found, but from a different angle. And I was in the frame searching the area with my team. Someone had been watching us, documenting our investigation from hundreds of yards away. But what made my blood run cold was the final 30 seconds. After we left, a light appeared and moved along the same path I'd walked during the search, following my exact route. Then it moved toward the camera's position until it filled the entire frame. The video ended there, cut off abruptly. I sat staring at my screen for a long time. The footage could be faked, but something about it felt genuine. Someone had documented whatever was happening in the Nevada desert, and they'd sent me the evidence. I made copies of all 4 videos, then took the original drive to Sheriff CR. He watched the footage in silence, his expression growing grimmer. When the videos ended, he said something I wasn't prepared for. "This is the third time." "Third time what?" "Third time in 20 years that someone has brought me evidence of unexplained phenomena in this county. First was in 2003. Second was 2011. Both times, federal agents showed up within days, confiscated the evidence, and made it clear we should forget anything happened." By Saturday morning, Sheriff CR had received official notice from the state attorney general's office that our investigation was being assumed by federal authorities, and we were instructed to cease all activities immediately. The notice threatened legal action if we failed to comply. Sunday night, my laptop caught fire. The battery somehow overheated, destroying the computer and all the video copies. When I checked my backup locations, both had been wiped clean. Someone had remotely accessed my systems and destroyed every copy of the footage. Monday morning, CR looked shaken. They visited me last night. 2 men, very polite, very professional, and absolutely clear that continued investigation would result in consequences we wouldn't enjoy. They knew about the videos, knew you'd made copies. That night, I drove to Constance Gilchrist's ranch. Her security cameras had captured something on October 22nd, a light moving across her property, heading east toward where Warren had disappeared. But there was more. On October 24th, her cameras recorded at least a dozen lights conducting a coordinated search operation across the surrounding desert. They moved in systematic patterns for almost 2 hours before withdrawing. "What do you think they were looking for?" Constance asked. "Witnesses," I said, or checking to make sure they hadn't left evidence behind. I was 15 mi from town on the drive back when I noticed headlights following me. A single vehicle maintaining steady distance, matching my speed precisely. It was the dark blue Suburban from before. The older federal agent pulled alongside and pointed toward the shoulder. When I stopped, he approached my window. "You're not very good at following instructions. Sheriff told you to drop the investigation. Yet here you are still gathering evidence, still asking questions. 2 people are missing, that's my jurisdiction. 2 people are being handled by appropriate authorities. You don't have resources, training, or clearance to investigate what happened to them." He paused. You want to know what they are? They're autonomous monitoring systems deployed by a classified program. Sometimes they malfunction. When that happens, people in the wrong place can be affected. It's unfortunate, but it's also why civilians like you don't need to know the specifics. That's a lie. Those systems are taking people. You know it's happening and you're covering it up. His expression hardened. You're interfering with operations vital to national security. People who interfere don't just lose jobs, they disappear from public record. They become complications that get resolved quietly and permanently. He started walking back to his vehicle, then turned. The lights are active tonight. Multiple systems in a coordinated search pattern. If I were you, I'd go home, lock my doors, and stay inside until morning. I drove toward Goldfield slowly, watching the sky. About 5 miles from town, I saw them. Not just 1 or 2 lights, but dozens spread across the northern horizon, moving in coordinated patterns. This was a professional operation using technology I couldn't identify. As I watched, 3 of the lights broke formation and started moving toward my position. They approached fast, and suddenly I understood the warning. I got back in the Explorer and accelerated toward town. The lights pursued, matching my speed easily at 70, then 80 mph. The instant I crossed into town limits, they stopped at the edge of the developed area, hovering as if held back by an invisible boundary. They'd followed me right to the edge of town and then withdrawn. The call came 3 days later. Unknown number voice I didn't recognize. There's something you need to see. The old radar installation. Be there at sunset. Come alone. I arrived an hour before sunset, watching for ambush. The sun was touching the western mountains when a figure emerged from the bunker. A woman, maybe mid-40s. You're the deputy investigating the disappearances. Who are you? Dr. Patricia Lansing. Until 6 months ago, I was a researcher with the program running those lights. I know what happened to Warren Duffin and Gilbert Armbruster, and I know you're in serious danger. Why are you telling me this? Because what they're doing is wrong. Because I watched people disappear and got told it was acceptable losses. She glanced at the darkening sky. We don't have much time. The systems will be active soon. The radar installations aren't just tracking systems, she said. They're part of an integrated network monitoring something that's been present in Nevada for decades. The lights are autonomous units, recovered systems reverse-engineered from crashed objects found in the Nevada desert. The program started after Roswell, but the real breakthroughs came in the 60s and 70s. What you're seeing now is the result of 50 years of black-budget research into technology that shouldn't exist. You're saying the government has been operating alien technology. Not alien in the sense most people mean. The objects came from somewhere that doesn't map to our understanding of space and time. She pulled out a folded map. The lights are reconnaissance units deployed to monitor this region and retrieve things they're programmed to find. Witnesses evidence people who have seen too much. When protocols activate, the systems retrieve the targets and bring them to collection sites for processing. Where are these facilities? She spread the map showing Nevada marked with various symbols. These red locations are confirmed retrieval sites. Blue are underground facilities where processing occurs. Yellow are radar installations that coordinate activities. How many people have they taken? Hundreds, possibly more. The program's been operational since the 80s. Most disappearances never get investigated seriously. Isolated individuals in remote areas, people without strong family connections. A faint mechanical humming grew louder. We both looked up to see a light approaching from the north. They found us. The systems monitor this installation. She shoved the map into my hands. Get out of here. Drive straight to town and don't stop. They won't pursue into Goldfield, but out here you're vulnerable. What about you? I'm already compromised. They've been looking for me since I left the program. She was backing toward the bunker. Go now. I drove toward the access road as the light descended toward the installation. In my rear view mirror, I saw it hovering above the bunker. Dr. Lansing had disappeared inside, and then I was around a bend and couldn't see any more. The map was detailed, marked with GPS coordinates and facility designations. If genuine, it represented evidence of a massive covert operation. Or it could be disinformation designed to make me look paranoid if I tried to act on it. Thursday morning, I spent hours in the records room searching old case files. Going back to the early 1990s, I found at least 30 cases matching the pattern. People disappearing from remote areas at night, vehicles found abandoned, federal authorities assuming investigations, and cases going cold without resolution. 30 people across 3 decades, each case treated as isolated, but together they formed an obvious pattern. Friday evening, I got a text from an unknown number. Dr. Lansing is dead. They found her at the installation. You're next if you don't stop. I drove to the radar installation that night. The site was empty, no sign of Dr. Lansing or any struggle, but the bunker entrance was now completely sealed with fresh concrete. Someone had covered up evidence with practice deficiency. Standing there in the dark, I understood I'd reached the end of what I could safely investigate. Dr. Lansing had been killed for trying to help me. Warren and Gilbert were gone, probably dead. 30 or more others over the decades had vanished into the same system. What made me think I could do better? But giving up meant accepting that powerful people could take others without consequence. Meant acknowledging that some lives mattered less than bureaucratic secrecy. The lights continue their patrols every night. I see them from my apartment window, moving across the northern sky with purpose and precision, sometimes distant, barely visible. Other nights they sweep closer to town, testing boundaries, reminding everyone they're still there, still operating, still taking people when protocols determine it's necessary. I keep investigating quietly, documenting what I can without attracting fatal attention. Sheriff CR knows and doesn't stop me, maintaining plausible deniability while providing what support he can. We both know this will probably end badly, but we also know some things are worth the risk. Warren Duran's wife still calls, sometimes asking if there's been any progress. I tell her we're still looking, still hoping, knowing it's a lie. Gilbert Armbruster's daughter has offered rewards, hired private investigators, done everything possible. None of it will work. The old radar grid still tracks something in the desert. Sometimes late at night, I drive to the remaining installations and watch the equipment that officially doesn't work anymore. Watch it tracking contacts that officially don't exist. Monitoring movements that federal authorities insist aren't happening. I don't know how this ends. Don't know if I'll eventually become another name in the files, another unexplained disappearance that gets quietly forgotten. But until that happens, I'll keep watching the desert. Keep documenting the patterns. Keep being a witness to something that powerful people want hidden because someone has to remember. Someone has to refuse to look away. Even if that someone is just a deputy in rural Nevada who stumbled across equipment that should have been forgotten and found that some secrets are more terrible than the silence surrounding them. The lights are out there tonight, moving through the darkness, searching, and tomorrow morning people will wake up across Esmeralda County, and most of them will never know how close they came to becoming the next name on a list that nobody admits exists. But I know, and now you know, too. Be careful out there in the empty places. Watch the skies on clear nights. And if you see lights moving in ways that shouldn't be possible, remember you're not imagining it. It's real. It's been real for decades. And the only reason you're allowed to see it is because nobody with power believes you'll be taken seriously if you tell anyone what you've witnessed. They're probably right. But maybe, just maybe, enough witnesses will finally add up to truth that can't be ignored or buried. Stay safe. Stay inside at night. And don't go investigating lights in the desert unless you're prepared to become part of the mystery instead of someone trying to solve it.